Hello! Today I'll be taking a look at Philip K. Dick's 1957 novel, Eye in the Sky. And it's a great one. In this novel, Dick takes on really two important issues, two issues that were very much on his mind in the 1950s. One is essentially Cold War surveillance states and how they manifest and what they're like and what their origin is. And essentially it comes to the conclusion that they're forms of mental illness or some kind of psychosis. The second thing it does is it continues something he began doing in The Cosmic Puppets, and that is exploring alternate realities. Now he does it in a very different way in Eye in the Sky than he does in Cosmic Puppets. In The Cosmic Puppets, it's gods who transform a town, Millgate, into a new town. With different people and different buildings and a different history and everything. And this is part of a larger cosmic battle between Zoroastrian deities. The human beings don't really much enter into the story except for one character who, because of a little quirk and a special position he's in, can remember how things were. To know more about Cosmic Puppets, watch my other video on that. In Eye in the Sky, the alternate realities that the characters experience, and they go through 4 of them throughout the novel. So there's actually like 5 realities in the world, the real world, and then 4 additional ones. They are all products of people's minds and people's subjectivities and the different ways that people look at the world. And the conclusion Dick seems to come to in Eye in the Sky is that none of us really look at the world in quite the same way, and that we're all a bit mentally ill, or we all have distortions in how we look at the world and understand it based on our preconceptions, based on our beliefs, based on, in some cases, it's trauma that happened to us in the past. For one character, it was a traumatic event. Sometimes it's just based on your history or where you come from or your place in life. And sometimes it's people who are legitimately clinically mentally ill. In other cases, it's just people who have strange ideologies or strange beliefs. But the result of that is fundamentally different ways of looking at the world. And out of this, Dick is able to play with the idea of alternate realities. Now, the nature of the novel being about subjectivity, being about the mind of 4 different characters, as the other characters are kind of thrust through it and forced to experience how other people see the world. This is very much a character-driven novel, much more so than Dick's other novels. At least the ones that came before. He does have good character-driven novels that came later, but this is the first one that has really memorable and sharply defined and distinct characters. In some of his earlier novels, the characters tended to float together or were kind of stereotypical, or they're things we've seen before in Dick's short stories. In Eye in the Sky, we really have a sharp set of characters. It's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but they are about as good as Dick got in this period of his career in really having memorable characters. And each character, you come out of this novel with 1 or 2 exceptions, with an idea of who these people are, and it's one of the strengths of the novel, I think. Now, basically our core set of characters are 8 people, and these are the 8 people who experience the various delusions and the different kind of mental realms that the characters go through. Now, the 2 of these are Martha and Jack Hamilton. Not Martha, Marcia, sorry. Marcia and Jack Hamilton. They're a married couple, and their marriage has a few problems. They're on a little bit of a different ideological wavelength. Marcia is a bit of a hippie. This is before the hippies, but she's kind of on the left, and she's interested in leftist politics and civil rights. And the novel being set in the 1950s, that is something that makes other characters around her a little bit uncomfortable from time to time. And the rumor throughout the novel is that she's a communist deep down. Her husband works in an electrical agency that's contracting to the government. Basically, he's in a high sensitivity, a high security clearance type of job, despite being in the private sector. So he's sort of kind of working for the government. And this is what creates the first conflict in the novel, which is between, is Marcia a communist or not? And he's basically given the choice at the start of the novel to quit his job or to, leave his wife or prove that she's not a communist. Now, the question kind of running through this whole novel is how can you prove what anyone thinks inside their head without being there? And so Dick throws this into people's heads to kind of nail this point home. Now, other characters we have one is Charlie Mcfate, who is the security agent for for the firm that Jack works for. He's the original one who identified Marcia as a security threat, but he's yet kind of friendly with them, and he's the closest we have in this novel to kind of the friend of the family. Next, we have a woman, a middle-aged, overweight, kind of doting mother named Edith Pritchett, and her son, I forgot his name. Let me check. Okay, David Pritchett. He's the least memorable character. Not much happens with him. He's kind of just an add-on to Edith Pritchett. And she's very conservative in morals. She likes things very nice and sweet. She likes fine-smelling soaps. She'd be the kind of person who would go to Yankee Candle and watch Lifetime, and she's that kind of person. And she really doesn't want her son to be raised in a world with anything distasteful or dirty or ugly. We don't really know this about her till later, but that's kind of how she emerges over the course of the story. There's a businesswoman named Joan Reese, who is the victim of some fairly ill-defined, but certainly clearly there, domestic abuse, violence by some man, and this has led her into becoming a paranoid, although we don't know that. Also, we don't know that till really later in the novel. Bill Laws is an African-American, and he's a scientist. I think he's working on his PhD. But doesn't have really a good job, so he's just a tour guide at the Bevatron particle deflator, a type of particle accelerator. I don't really know what it is technically. I'm not even sure Dick cares. It's just a weird science device. But he's the tour guide, and he's bringing people through in the tours. And then there's Arthur Sylvester, who's an old war veteran who is also on the tour. So those characters make up our core 8 characters. Now we get the sense that Dick, if he would have had time, could have dragged us through 8 different mental realms, but he spends about half the novel on the first mental realm, and then he spends the next quarter of the novel on a second one, and this doesn't give him much time to go through 2 more, and he starts to get rushed. And it sort of works in the novel because you feel these worlds breaking down as the real world starts to inject itself into these worlds more thoroughly. Like it starts to break, whatever happened to them starts to wear off, I guess. However, you do wonder if Dick could have done 4 more mental realms. I think it's a real shame we don't get David Pritchett's interpretation of the world because, children must look at the world very differently, and it'd be really interesting to see what Dick could do with the world according to a child. So that kind of gives you the big idea of what the novel's about and what it's trying to do. And from this point on, I'm going to go into a little bit of spoiler areas. I don't really care too much about spoilers for books that were written, 50 years ago. But if you haven't read Eye in the Sky and you want to, you may want to tune out for a while on some of the things I have to say. So as the novel begins, Jack's basically told he's got to leave his wife if he wants to keep his job. He basically refuses. He decides he's going to get a job somewhere else. But first, he goes to visit the particle deflator with Charlie and his wife. During that visit, there's an accident. So those 3 characters and 5 others, and I've already mentioned who they are, fall into the particle deflator, and then they wake up in a hospital room, not knowing where they're at. In fact, they're in the first of these mental realms. The first one they experience is a world in which God is real, and God answers prayers. And so Dick then kind of defines a world. What would a world look like if God existed and answered prayers and manna literally came from heaven if people asked for it, and if you needed money, you asked God for it, and you got it. God really cured amputees if you asked him to. What would be the purpose of work in such a society? Where would sin lie in such a world? And they even create a bar. There's a bar there that people can go to be sinful, and that sort of gives that's almost like a dialectical relationship with virtue. Now, the religion being reflected here is a religion of the belief of a new religious movement called Second Babism, and of course, Babism is a real new religious movement. I think it comes out of the 19th century, kind of as a branch off of Islam or a Muslim heresy, perhaps. But the Baha'i faith is kind of connected to that set of beliefs. But Second Bab is what I don't know if there really is a Second Bab, but that's what we have in this book, and this is the world created by Arthur Sylvester. And he does it kind of without willing it. He just really sees the world this way. And because I think he was the last to be awake, but everyone else passed out, and he was the last to be awake, he kind of had control of defining the world. And so then he does this. It's a geocentric world. there's really a heaven and hell. These are physical areas, and it's really bizarre and wonderful. Angels come down to help people. There's tests of faith instead of security clearances and security checks. So that's he has a lot of fun with that, and he spends about half the novel in that world. The second world they experience after they break out of that one is that created by Edith Pritchett. This is a profoundly uncreative world in the sense that all Edith Pritchett can do is abolish things she doesn't like. She keeps some things she likes, and the most creative she gets is keeping a few things, but essentially all she can do is abolish the distasteful things. Now this world is sort of a self-perpetuating failure, because eventually if you abolish everything that offends you or disgusts you a little bit, you're going to be left with nothing very quickly, and that's what happens. So within a day or two, Edith's world breaks apart. Now, I said a couple days, but this whole thing takes place over seconds in the real world, but it's like 7-8 days maybe over the in the mental realms that the characters are dwelling in. The third world they enter is that of Joan Reese, and she's trying to create the perfect surveillance state where we are protected against everything. Unfortunately, she's a paranoid, so she also thinks that there really are spiders in the basement and monsters in the closet, and bad things happen to a reason. Accidents are plots against you, and so that world is also self-destructive and bound to fail because everything works against you. And so eventually, she even imagines the other people these eight people, or the other 7 she's with, as monsters, and they end up easily defeating her and destroying her, and that world breaks down very quickly. The final world they enter is created by Charlie Mcfate, and it's the best way to describe it would be a stereotypical leftist view of capitalism. So it's a capitalist world, but it's a capitalism as full of all the cliches of leftist thought. That the gangsters run the show, that all the working class are oppressed and politically active and members of communist parties and ready to revolt and in constant riot. There are gated communities and slums. The rich are all, suit wearing, top hat wearing kind of monopoly characters, and on and on. So it's a very brutal world, and it's very harsh, but it's essentially how, if you see the world as a hardcore communist might see, this is what it would look like. And that one kind of breaks down on its own because the whole thing they're in, I think, starts to break down. But before they get that, Mcfate transforms himself into a character called Commissar, some kind of commissar, and it's kind of a superhuman, almost quasi-defined figure. And eventually they get to the real world, and Jack then says, my wife's not the communist. He goes back to his boss and says, my wife's not the communist. Actually, it was Charlie. And the boss says, well, you can't prove it. And he just turns that around and says, well, you couldn't prove Marshall was the communist either, yet you punished me for that. He decides to leave work in kind of high security areas and instead take a job at, making phonographs and repairing phonographs using money invested by Edith Pritchett based on their shared love of classical music, something they learned about each other while they were dwelling in each other's minds. So it ends up with a fairly happy ending for all the characters. There are a couple side characters that exist sort of to help define the world. These aren't the core 8, but they're people that come in and out of these realms. One of the most important of these is a young woman named Silky, who appears in a different form in each world. In one, she's a prostitute. In the second, she's a desexualized friend of Marcia who becomes a threat to the family. In the third world, she is a spider creature. And in the fourth world, she's again a prostitute, but now she's like a hardcore communist and an underground member of a communist cell. In a sense, she's key in defining each of these worlds, but she doesn't really exist as a character in her own right. She's something that gets manipulated and changed. This novel has some very, very interesting, I guess, a little bit under the radar, but they're there if you read closely, or even if you don't read that closely, they're there. But they're not like Dick's not banging you over the head with them, but they are important thematic elements in this book, revolving around the issues of gender and a little bit on sexuality and also with race. So I'll start with race because that's the easiest to talk about. Now, there's one African-American character named Bill Laws. And of course, in 1957, you had still segregation in much of America. You didn't yet have the Civil Rights Act. Now, this is set in California, which didn't have Jim Crow, but it certainly had plenty of racism. And it was difficult at times for black people to get ahead, especially in their professions. And Bill Laws is trying to make it as a scientist. Yet he's given this kind of bad job of being a tour guide, not really given full ability to advance as much as he could as a scientist. And during one of the worlds they're in, the one of Edith Pritchett, he decides this is good and he doesn't want to help break it down. He says he basically wants to stay in this world. And the reason he gives is, Edith has promoted me to be the head of a soap factory. Now, the soap factories are one of the few factories she kept around because she finds most factories distasteful. But she kept that one and she promoted Bill Laws. So he actually found his life getting better. Another thing about his character is he often appeared as how, especially in the case of the first world they're in, Arthur Sylvester, he starts to appear as that character sees black people. So it's pretty clear that Arthur Sylvester is a racist and had all kinds of stereotypes about black people in his head. And Bill Laws is forced to adapt to how the creator of the world sees black people. Now, gender is much harder to talk about here because it's quite complex. There is the marriage between Jack and Hamilton, and not Jack Hamilton and Marcia Hamilton. Marcia is progressive. She's interested in left-wing politics. She goes to meetings. She's not the typical 50s housewife, let's put it that way. And, you know, she's so much active that Jack even doubts if she's a communist or not. Now, this marriage seems to be troubled, and the character of Silky helps to expose problems in the marriage, some of them seeming to deal with sexuality, because Jack Hamilton certainly is attracted to Silky, and at one point even makes moves to try to sleep with her, although it's in a world that Edith Pritchett has eliminated sex in, so it's kind of a joke, but it does show that there's deep problems and fractures in that relationship. And this is brought to the head at the end of the novel when Jack, convinced that Marcia is the creator of the communist or the communist-inspired dystopia, at the end shoots his wife to break free of that world. And when she doesn't die and they stay in the world, they realize that Marcia, in the end, is not the true communist. Now, also we have other images of women here, though. We have Edith Pritchett, who is presented as the very moralistic mother, who's very paranoid about her son and the kind of world her son is going to grow up in, but becomes very passive-aggressive and very authoritarian when she has a bit of power for herself. And she is a character who just likes to purge things and destroy anything distasteful. And I don't know if this is a character that Dick, interacted with or had some encounter with in his real life, but it's a fairly stereotypical character, I guess. But it's a very violent character in the end because she's eager to eradicate anything she doesn't like, and all in the name of kind of creating the ideal world for his kid. Joan Reese is also a very interesting character because she's a businesswoman, so she doesn't conform to 1950 stereotypes of a housewife. And also she is apparently the victim of domestic violence. The best evidence for this is when in her paranoid world, they're in the house, and the house begins to take on the form of her ex-boyfriend. And especially the door becomes a big mouth. And there's a strong suggestion in that section that she became a paranoid because of things he did to her. And this fundamentally transformed her psychology. And I think that's something that should be considered when we look at her character and how we interpret her and her actions and her desire to create a safe world, a world where no one can harm her or harm the people she loves and cares about. So there's actually quite a lot to say about gender as well. However, the big themes of this book comes down to subjectivity, how we all have a slightly distorted view of the world. We'll share a lot of things in common, but at the margins, we all see the world differently. And so we really can't know each other fully. The other theme, of course, is the surveillance state. All 5 of the worlds we live in are surveillance states of various types. The first one, the real world, is a surveillance state in the sense that there's the anti-communist conspiracy or anti-communist crusade. In the Arthur Sylvester's world, the religious world, it's literally an eye in the sky, God watching everything. In the third world, Edith Pritchett's, it's the second fake world, but it's the third we encounter. Edith Pritchett's world, she's the one who has the power to destroy anything she doesn't like. So she kind of becomes the eye in the sky. In the next world, it's Joan Reese herself who becomes the eye in the sky, trying to, again, and she actually openly justifies what she does in the grounds of creating a security culture. And she says, you'll thank me for what I'm doing because I'm going to keep you safe, which is, of course, the exact rhetoric of the surveillance state, especially in the post 9/11 times. And then the final world, it's, of course, the capitalist class takes on the role as the eye in the sky, but plus you have the communist conspiracy that you presume is keeping an eye on things. So the surveillance state runs through all the stories, and in the end, the characters decide to just withdraw from that entirely and do something more meaningful, something that doesn't involve the bosses watching over your shoulder. So that is my overall review of Eye in the Sky by Philip K. Dick. Again, it's a really wonderful story, I think, of this, of his early novels. This is really a breakout work. Yeah, it has a lot of problems. It's a little bit rushed at the end, but it's just so much fun. It's also one of his funniest works. He even wrote a whole book called The Man Who Japed. I did a review on that. I have another video on that. But that story is not particularly funny. This one has laugh out loud moments throughout the novel. And Dick, you can tell, is just having a lot of fun in the way he constructs these worlds and imagines them and plays around with them. So I really recommend this. And if you like especially Dick's shifting realities and kind of stories, check this one out if you haven't yet. It's great. So thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe, and you can watch some of my other videos. I have reviews of other American writers using the Library of America series. That's my source material. And then I'll keep putting up stuff on Philip K. Dick. In fact, my next video on Philip K. Dick will be looking at the stories published in 1957. There's 3 of them. So again, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.